Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar. Please just give us 1 or 2 minutes so that we can go live on our other live stream channels, and we will be with you shortly. Thank you so much. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. Let's see. Welcome to today's event titled How the World Failed Gaza, the Great March of Return 6 years on, a conversation with Dr. Norman Finkelstein. My name is Jihad Abu Salim. I'm the Executive Director of the Jerusalem Fund for Education and Community Development and its educational program, the Palestine Center. The Jerusalem Fund is a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit dedicated to educating the public about Palestine and the Palestinian experience and narrative. We are honored to host this virtual event featuring Dr. Norman Finkelstein today. 6 years ago, on March 30th, 2018, Palestinians in the Gaza Strip launched one of the century's largest and longest protest movements, the first day of which coincided with the anniversary of the Palestinian Land Day. The Land Day was first observed on March 30th, 1976, following a general strike and marches in response to the Israeli government's announcement of a plan to expropriate thousands of dunams of land for state purposes. Fast forward to 2018. Against the backdrop of the Trump administration's unprecedented support for Israel and its detrimental policies towards the Palestinian issue, activists, organizers, and leaders in the Gaza Strip sought to challenge this reality, giving rise to the Great March of Return. The March of Return as a movement was characterized by large rallies and cultural activities near the Gaza-Israel barrier. And it highlighted and underscored the plight of the Palestinian refugees displaced in 1948, who now constitute nearly 70% of Gaza's population. The Great March of Return also highlighted the Israeli blockade that has been imposed on the Gaza Strip since 2007, which rendered the Gaza Strip unlivable according to the United Nations. Despite being unarmed, the protests of the Great March of Return were met with lethal force from Israeli snipers, resulting in significant casualties amongst Palestinians. Today, as we reflect on the March of Return amidst the ongoing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza, our event today aims to revisit this crucial chapter of Gaza's history and connect it to the current moment that we are living and experience it today. Despite years of appeals for global attention to their plight, particularly in Gaza, Palestinians' cries have largely been ignored. The Great March of Return stands as a clear effort to bring their struggle to light, but yet it was dismissed and ignored. To delve deeper into the significance of this event and its aftermath, I am honored to welcome Dr. Norman Finkelstein, a distinguished scholar and author, renowned for his critical analyses, including works on the issue of the Holocaust and its use and its place within the broader context of the discussion on Palestine and Israel, and also the blockade and successive aggressions against the Gaza Strip. Dr. Finkelstein has been named one of the world's most influential political scientists, and we are looking forward today to hearing his insights and analysis on the March of Return and the current moment that we live in. Dr. Finkelstein, thank you so much for joining us. Following your presentation, we will open the floor for discussion and a Q&A session. Please submit your questions through the Q&A feature if you are joining us via the Zoom webinar, or post them as replies or comments on our social media live streams. We will ensure they are addressed. So without further ado, Dr. Finkelstein, the floor is yours now.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Let me begin with the present rather than the past, namely March 30th, 2018. In the current horrors that are unfolding in Gaza, one question that, in my opinion, has been ignored is, what were the options available to the people of Gaza up to October 6th? Unless you can point to options in a situation like the people of Gaza, namely, they have been confined for 20 or more years in what Israel's head of the National Security Council, Giora Eiland, called already as far back as 2004. He called Gaza, quote, a huge concentration camp. So, before you condemn what happened on October 7th, it seems to me you have to ask the question, what were the options available to the people who had been confined, in large part, had been confined from birth, into a concentration camp, and it looked as of October 6th that they were not only born into a concentration camp, not only had they languished in that concentration camp, but they would die in that concentration camp. That was the situation they were confronted with. So, the usual response to the question, what were their options? The usual response is, well, Hamas was committed to Israel's destruction, so you couldn't negotiate with it. And why didn't the people of Gaza try nonviolent civil disobedience like Gandhi, Martin Luther King? You know the whole routine, okay? Well, let's look at those options. Option number one. From the moment Hamas came into power, it was sending signals, diplomatic signals, that it was prepared to accept a two-state settlement along the June 1967 border, what's called the international consensus on how to resolve the conflict. Now, I will admit there were aspects of Hamas's proposals or signals that required further negotiation. For example, Hamas was insisting on the full right of return of the Palestinian refugees. Even though legally they're on very firm ground, one could say as a matter of politics, it would have required further negotiations. That's not what happened. What happened was Israel, the United States, and the EU imposed these brutal economic sanctions on Gaza. And whenever it seemed as if the Gazans or Hamas was prepared for some sort of diplomatic resolution, Israel launched one of its high-tech massacres in Gaza, what it calls its operations, in order to prevent a diplomatic resolution of the conflict. Without going into the details, because that's not the point, that's not the focus of today's talk, what we can safely say is Hamas tried the diplomatic route, but it failed. So the next obvious question, which brings us to the subject matter today, is the question is, why didn't Hamas, Gaza try what Gandhi did, what Martin Luther King did? And here is the, you might call it, amusing response? They did. They tried nonviolent resistance. They tried it in March 2018, the Great March of Return. Now, what happened? What happened is as clear as a crystal clear day. You know why it's clear? Because the United Nations, the Human Rights Council, appointed a very sophisticated committee or commission to investigate what happened. And to their credit, they produced a 250-page single-spaced report on what happened during that Great March of Return. It is a strenuous exercise to get through this mammoth report. Now, without going into the details, because now is not the time and place, let me present to your viewers the essence of what the court found. The essence of what the commission found. Number one, from March 30th to May 14th, the Great March of Return was overwhelmingly nonviolent. They described it as a festive, almost carnival-like atmosphere where families met, picnics, entertainment, music, dancing. It was, for my generation, you could say it was Gaza's Woodstock. People joyously, and I say this painfully, the people of Gaza joyously celebrating life inside a concentration camp, joyously celebrating life in a huge concentration camp. What happened? The commission reports that according to Israel, they lined up along the perimeter of Gaza their best trained snipers. Okay? Number two, Israel stated afterwards, every bullet fired by those snipers hit the intended target. That's not the commission. That's Israel saying every bullet fired hit the intended target. What were the intended targets? I would recommend to all your listeners to read the report. A huge chunk of the report is given over to chronicling in excruciating detail who was killed. What they called emblematic cases, typical cases, emblematic cases. What did the commission find? It found that Israel deliberately targeted children. You know how Israel always says, what makes us different from Hamas is we don't deliberately target civilians? Well, here, this distinguished commission found that Israel not only deliberately targeted civilians, deliberately targeted children. Israel deliberately targeted medics. Israel deliberately targeted journalists. And Israel deliberately targeted disabled people, people on crutches, people in wheelchairs. The people it describes, because as I said, they go into excruciating detail. They were 200 and 300 meters from the borderline, the perimeter of Gaza. They were standing next to trees. They were taking selfies. What else did the commission find? Israel was deliberately targeting the demonstrators, overwhelmingly nonviolent, targeting them from their kneecaps down to inflict what's called life-changing injuries on them, which is just a euphemism for paralyzing them for life. That's what the commission found. Now, on May 14th, Israel committed a major massacre against the overwhelmingly nonviolent protesters. And after the accumulation of deaths, it was inevitable that the demonstration would deteriorate. That's not because Hamas or Gazans are inherently violent. It's because of the essence of what nonviolent resistance is about. Nonviolent resistance is based on the following premise. You're never going to convince your enemy that what they're doing is wrong. They are too hardened in their beliefs, in their convictions, in their moral corruption or depravity. They are too they're too convinced of the rightness of their moral depravity. You're never going to convince them. The whole point of nonviolent resistance is to try to convince the passive bystanders to do something out of a sense of pity. So you take the American South. Nobody in the civil rights movement believed that you are going to persuade white people in the American South to change their hearts. It wasn't going to happen. And nobody believed that they would pity the suffering of Black people in the American South. The purpose of the nonviolent resistance was to awaken the conscience of the federal government and of the North to put a stop to the horrors that were unfolding before people's eyes. The fire hoses aimed at the high intensity fire hoses aimed at the children in Birmingham, the killings, the beatings, that was designed to move the hearts, not of the people in the South, because that was never going to happen. They were too hardened and their convictions were too deep to be altered. Why do I say that? Because if the federal government in our own country had not intervened and the killings in the American South became widespread, the nonviolence would have eventually changed into violence. It was the fact that the federal government sent in troops in the South that enabled the nonviolent resistance to work. So, if the federal troops hadn't been sent in, if the Black children were the targets of white violence, of course, at some point, people would have concluded, like the people concluded in Gaza, that nonviolence doesn't work, and they would have chosen more militant, violent tactics. What happened in the case of the Great March of Return is it failed to move the international community. The international community, both at the formal level, the official level, and also at the unofficial level, what you might call the level of civil society. The solidarity movement with the Palestinians was totally and completely unresponsive to the nonviolence of the Great March of Return. And so it was doomed to failure, not because of their failings. They stayed nonviolent for 6 weeks in the face of targeting children, medics, journalists, disabled people, and paralyzing thousands of young people for life. It wasn't their failing. It was our failing. And the question then is, obviously, and that's where I'll leave off, the question is, why did it fail? What went wrong? That's, of course, a complex question. I would say, even though factually, as the report makes clear, that 250-page report, even though factually Hamas did not what's the word? Even though it wasn't Hamas that came up with the idea of these demonstrations, and that at its inception, Hamas was not the dominating force. What happened was, it was very easy for the international community to claim that Hamas was behind the Great March of Return, and to use that as an excuse to justify Israel's violent reaction, namely lurking behind the demonstrators was Hamas waiting to infiltrate into Israel to cause murder and mayhem. Factually, it wasn't true. The Hamas became a dominant element later, but at the beginning, it really was a grassroots undertaking, not unlike the First Intifada in 1987, which also, as you probably know, began in Gaza December 7th, 1987, but then quickly spread to the West Bank. So the first problem was Hamas was used as an excuse to delegitimize these non-violent demonstrations by claiming that behind these non-violent demonstrations was this violent force called Hamas. Secondly, that's at the official level, it was delegitimized. But secondly, you have to say at the grassroots level, there was no support for the Great March of Return. First of all, none in the West Bank. If you go back, you'll see Practically no support. There may have been one or two demonstrations. That was it. No support for the people of Gaza. And they were obviously the first constituency that should have been moved into action. But I can tell you, because I vividly recall it, there was not one demonstration in my own city of New York, not one, in support of the people of Gaza during the Great March of Return. Now, you might ask why. I think there are a lot of reasons, but one is there's a portion of the left that only reacts to, and the Solidarity movement, which only reacts to violent resistance and finds nonviolent resistance sort of liberal and not as glamorous as violent resistance. I think that's a problem in the Solidarity movement, the notion that nonviolent resistance is just not as militant as violent resistance. I think there are other reasons, but the bottom line was at both the official level and at the Solidarity level, they got no support, and so it had to fail. Whether Hamas have done more to distance itself, to say this is not us, this is the people, they are self-organizing. Whether they could have done more, I think that's a tough question. I don't think they could have done more. I think the fact that the leadership in Gaza was going to be used to taint and delegitimize the demonstrations such that they would not command the sympathy that nonviolent civil resistance normally would.
Thank you so much for this, Dr. Finkelstein. You raised a lot of important points, and I think the issue of Hamas's involvement or lack thereof. I think the way Hamas's role in Gaza has been talked about, especially here in the West, has been problematic in the sense that it leads to a misunderstanding of the dynamics within Gaza, because there is a tendency to view Hamas as this foreign body that has been parachuted into the political life in Gaza and the civil society therein, because people in the West would want to think of Hamas as some sort of a foreign body that can be removed at their convenience whenever they want. So I think the problem here is with the lack of understanding of the dynamics within Gaza and Hamas's role as part of a complex and rich civil society there, and its role that also extends beyond just being a government or an armed militant movement that is engaged in armed struggle. But I would like to talk about this, but before that, I would like to highlight this issue that you've raised about the place of Gaza, not just within the broader focus of the international community, but also within the focus of the solidarity movement in the West in general, and here in the United States in particular. As a Palestinian from Gaza who's been in this country for nearly 11 years, I found myself engaged in two levels of advocacy. So on one hand, I was engaged in general advocacy efforts to highlight what's happening in Gaza, but also I was advocating for the solidarity movement to talk about Gaza more. And I wanted to ask you, delve deeper into this point. Do you think there are structural barriers that have to do with further criminalization of activists and organizers and institutions in the scenario of them talking about Gaza or addressing Gaza or organizing about with regards to Gaza has been there a culture of fear around Gaza that prevented certain segments of the solidarity movement from addressing Gaza and talking about it and organizing around it.
I do believe there's a problem there. The problem is that the Western left, which includes the Palestine Solidarity Movement, the Western left is overwhelmingly secular and on many cultural, social issues is at loggerheads in conflict with the leadership in Gaza and probably also a large portion of the population on issues, everything from abortion to gay rights, to gay marriage, to women's rights, and so forth. There is a clear conflict of opinion between the Western left, which incorporates the Palestine Solidarity community. There's a clear conflict of opinion between them and Gaza, which prevents or at least attenuates, limits the capacity for identification with the people of Gaza. Now, it's very easy to identify people when they're the object of a genocide. You don't much care what they believe. Everyone has a right to life. But short of the genocide, Western leftists are much more at home with the Ramallah Palestinians than they are with the Khan Yunis Palestinians. Ramallah is just a Western transplant on Palestinian soil. They have the same cultural outlook as any Western leftist. So it's easier to identify, to feel a empathy with the people in the West Bank than with the people in Gaza. Now, of course, now things have changed, but that's because, as I said, there is a genocide, and when it comes to the point of genocide, one doesn't necessarily have to feel a kind of cultural identification. It's people being systematically murdered. But in general, yes, Westerners, leftists, are much more comfortable with Ramallah Palestinians than they are with Gaza Palestinians. And that has caused a certain estrangement between the two groups of people. And you always get hit by Israelis. They say, and in Gaza, you get killed if if a woman has an extramarital relation or if a guy is gay. And it's very hard to defend against that, argument. It's hard to answer back. Whereas you don't have that same problem when it comes to Ramallah. I don't know the current constitution, the so-called Palestinian Authority, but I'm sure it, without even having read it, I'm sure it guarantees gays' rights and women's rights and all that sort of stuff. So I do think there has been a cultural estrangement between the Western left and Gaza, except in moments of mass killing. The biggest demonstrations by far preceding now were during Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9. There were huge demonstrations. Interestingly, there was very little during Operation Protective Edge in 2014. I'm not quite sure why, but it was much larger in 2008-9, and now it's been truly heroic the young people, their solidarity.
Perhaps in 2014, we had the backdrop of the Arab Spring / uprisings and the differences it created in opinion and analysis and how different people approached that moment. But I have one more question before I start taking questions from our audience, and it has to do with the pre-October 6, 2023 Israeli vision for Gaza. In 2017, I watched a report, a 15-minute report that was broadcasted on Israeli Channel 11. And the report included a number of interviews with Israeli leaders from the security and intelligence establishments. And it was a kind of assessment of how Israel has approached the Gaza Strip since it unilaterally withdrew in 2005. And what I gathered watching this report, and I translated it to English, it's available on my YouTube channel. I can link it for the audience to watch. What was interesting for me is the lack of long-term thinking about Gaza. Yeah.
There was no long-term thinking because it was a dead issue. I had already in 2020, I resolved I'm not going to write any more about Palestine or Gaza. I had written quite a lot on Gaza because I figured, okay, this has become pointless. The issue was dead. It wasn't discussed anymore. People don't want to remember that. It was a dead issue. It was a dead letter. At that point in time, just before October 7th, all the focus was on building on the Abraham Accords, bringing Saudi Arabia into the alliance, and that the whole conflict would be resolved over the heads of the people of Palestine. You said there was no long-term thinking. That's absolutely correct. There was no long-term thinking. You know why? Because they had resolved and they were convinced they could just leave the people in Gaza to languish and die in the concentration camp. They didn't have to think about it anymore. The matter had been, in their minds, resolved. So that's all the more reason to understand what happened on October 7th happened, because the world had forgotten about them by that point. And they didn't think they needed any long-term planning. All they needed was, in their minds, to create a kind of Palestinian authority in Gaza. Some people they were there. We shouldn't lie about these things. There was a very rich class of people in Gaza. They went to very good hotels. They lived a very good life. And Israel thought, as they did with the Palestinian Authority, just give them what was called in the Oslo Accord of 1995, Oslo II. It was called VIP status. There was a VIP status 1, VIP status 2, VIP status 3. Just give them a VIP status, give them money, or let Qatar give them money, and Gaza will go away. That was the hope. You create a thin elite layer who's prospering, and the problem will expire. It will dissipate. It will disappear. And it would disappear for that thin layer in Gaza. Qatar was giving a lot of money. There's no question about that. So they thought they would create a mini Palestinian Authority in Gaza, and the problem would go away. It didn't go away.
The population of Gaza was projected to double by 2050. So we were talking about a population of 2 million, reaching a number of 4.3 million in 2050, a population density that would increase from 6,000 human beings per 1 square kilometer to 12,000. Israeli decision makers had no idea what to do about this.
I don't think that's entirely correct. Their thinking was you could maintain the status quo. the fact that it's going to be double the population, in their minds, demographics don't automatically translate into politics. They don't. You got very densely populated countries where there's no resistance. And as they looked at the political map in Gaza, there was no resistance at that point. There was a 2021, yes, there was resistance. But after 2021, there were skirmishes. I know, 2022, but in general, they thought this status quo, what they called, their famous expression, periodically mowing the lawn, they thought that was a workable long-term solution. That Gaza, once Saudi Arabia was inside, the American orbit, the American-Israeli orbit, it's a done deal. It's over. So, you talk about population density, so then they're thinking, well, then maybe we'll relax the blockade, people will emigrate, they will leave. Look, a large part of the population, my day, millions of people in China, in what China was called back then the sick man of Asia, millions of people in China starved to death each year. That was just a condition of life. And that was Gaza was turned into a game preserve where the animals would go to their burial ground and just die. That's it. That's what Gaza was. It was a game preserve, a concentration camp. The British economists called it a toxic dump. They didn't waste the batting of an eyelash in Gaza, except, making sure the elite gets the money.
And what is the source of this dehumanization, particularly of Gaza? I mean, you reference some cultural aspects, but do you also think that the essence of the what Palestinians or the Palestinian plight is so explicit in Gaza in a way that makes it harder for Israel to recognize, or Israelis to recognize, the humanity of the people in Gaza? And here I'm talking about the fact that Gaza was an explicit creation of the 48 war and the establishment of the state of Israel, and people are trapped there in the millions. They are able to see their lands and villages across the fence that separates them from the territories that are now under the control of what is the state of Israel. So I think, do you think this is also a reason or a factor behind this immense dehumanization of Palestinians in Gaza by Israel and Israeli society, in addition, of course, to the role that Gaza has played historically in defying Israel's occupations and aggressions, and in launching the various episodes of resistance, whether armed or unarmed, as we saw in 56 and after the 67 occupation and during the first Intifada. Does Gaza's role dictate its fate in terms of how it resisted Israel's occupation?
I think it's a combination of a cultural one, which we talked about earlier, with the fact that Gaza was always a pinprick at the side of Israel because they refused to acquiesce in the fate that Israel had meted out for them. They resisted. And the more they resisted, even though their resistance was in a way a testament to their humanity, that they weren't going to accept the fact that, hey, they had been consigned to a game preserve, the resistance had the reverse effect. Rather than it being a testament to their humanity, it became a testament to their savagery, which is exactly, you say you lived in the United States now for how many years? 20 years?
11 years.
Excuse me? How many?
11 years.
11 years. So let me give you a simple example. I came from a very decent home. My parents had very good values, or imparted good values to us. But I remember as a kid, we used to watch what were called back then, I'm talking about the 1950s and 60s, what were called cowboy and Indian movies, the cowboys and the Indians. Now, I can tell you from personal witness, I hated the Indians. I'm speaking personally as I watched the TV show. I hated them. When the cowboys set their teepees on fire and they were being incinerated, I was ecstatic. I was euphoric. They weren't called Indians back then. They were called savages. Literally, just like now, terrorists. Back in my day, savages. I never conceived Indians as fighting for their rights. We didn't think of it that way. We thought of them as, were it not for them, life would be so nice. But these savages are trying to destroy everything because they're so backward, they're so primitive, they're so inhuman. I remember we had a famous movie. You could still find it on YouTube, I'm sure. It was by Walt Disney. It was called Remember the Alamo. The Alamo was a fort in Texas, San Antonio, Texas, okay? And all the great heroes of growing up in our country, not just me, people like Jim Bowie, Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, Lieutenant Travers, I know all their names. They all went to the Alamo to defend the Alamo, okay? And my whole childhood was traumatized by the fact that those goddamn Mexicans, led by Santa Anna, killed everybody in the Alamo. And for a large part of my childhood, I was always thinking, oh, if they only had one machine gun, they could have killed Santa Anna's troops. I only learned when I was an adult, literally an adult, that those folks, the folks in the Alamo were trying to steal Texas from Mexico. I had no idea. I thought they were defending themselves against the savages. So it's not hard for me to understand why the people of Israel hate Gaza so much. I would really like, if they could, I think 9 out of 10 Israelis would love to nuke Gaza. 9 out of 10 would love to nuke Gaza. You know, for me, it's not a alien notion, because I understand it in myself, how I understood the reality around me. You know, in the United States, the very first movie in Hollywood to acknowledge what was really done to the Native Americans wasn't until the 1970s. I was already 20 years old. It was a film called Little Big Man with Dustin Hoffman. He was a prominent actor at the time. All the way into the 70s, we all thought the Indians were savages. Yes, I was already over 20. I was born in 53. And I think Little Big Man, I think it came out in 74. I could be wrong. But so that sort of cultural ambiance and really cultural poison is not an alien fact to me. So I can get where the people in Israel are at. And I would also say, you could, even though there's now in the United States, of course, especially in universities, a profound sympathy and empathy for what was done to the Native Americans. It's also true, like October 7th, the Native Americans committed many savage acts. It's true. Of course, we did. The Euro-Americans did. Now a Euro-American, but I'm Jewish, so that's even problematic. But they committed any savage acts. They were resisting their expulsion from their home. So it's not altogether shocking that savage acts are going to occur. If somebody came to my apartment and just tried to remove one piece of furniture, I don't think I would remain very calm.
And on that note, Dr. Finkelstein, I would like to take some questions from the audience. We have a question from Faris, who says, you have recently said that you have become pessimistic because the axis of resistance is convinced that now Israel can be defeated and that the conflict has now become a zero-sum equation. But don't you think that Israel was always an eliminationist settler colonial project that saw its relationship with the natives as a zero-sum game? You've often quoted Morris's line that transfer was inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism. Following that, wasn't this zero-sum equation always inevitable?
No, I don't think. Oh, look, first of all, it's a good question, and the person who's asking it is obviously informed and knows my thinking on the subject, and I respect that. It's what the person said is absolutely accurate as a factual matter, and I'm a strong believer. My credo in life is never quarrel with facts, and the question is factually based. My answer to that question is very simple. The United States was an exterminationist country at the beginning. It was determined it wanted to create a white state. So a precondition for creating that white state was, exactly as in the case of Israel, to quote Benny Morris, to carry out an expulsion, and the expulsion had elements within it of extermination. However, to your listener, I would say there was also another element that had to be somehow marginalized to create this white state, and that was the African American element. And you could say that was deeply entrenched in our society. It was entrenched in clauses of our Constitution, such as the famous 3/5 rule. A Black slave was 3/5 of a person. Nonetheless, our country was able to evolve. And what was deeply entrenched at one point in our country's history, I think an honest person would have to say significant, certainly not enough, but significant progress has occurred. Now, your listener might say, yeah, but the Native American population was pretty much wiped out, and it's now very marginal to us. I think that's true. But I don't believe in this idea that's quite popular, this notion of original sin, that because you were born in sin, you can't transcend it, that you are, it's, as we nowadays use the expression, sin is baked into your DNA. No, I think with significant popular struggle, you can transform a society. I think it's an utterly magnificent testament to South Africa that it presented itself to the world with a very dignified delegation at the ICJ that included a significant number of older white dudes like John Dugard and Vaughn Lowe, younger people, men, women, African American, white, what they call, the rainbow nation. South Africa evolved. It's still not a fair place. Most Black people now are doing economically worse today than they were doing under the apartheid regime. That's a fact. The average Black person is worse off economically now than under the apartheid regime. But I don't think it makes rational sense to deny significant positive things happen. And I believe that's possible in any society. I don't believe in the notion of original sin baked into the DNA. There are ways. I don't believe it's possible now in Israel. Not now. No, the place is crazy. I have no doubt about that. But I don't think these things are irreversible. I should say, I don't believe that they are not susceptible to change.
Thank you for this. I've received a lot of questions, so I don't know how much time do you have, but I would really appreciate it if we could answer some of these questions.
I'm going to have to, I can't go on too long because I'm not doing any work anymore. People are saying, Norman, every day that you're doing more interviews and more interviews. Yeah, it's gotten out of hand. No, I feel, okay, it's the moment because it's Gaza. So it's the moment. On the other hand, I have to keep giving fresh ideas, fresh thoughts. Otherwise, I'm just repeating myself, which is not a good thing. So I have to do work, and I hope your listeners, your viewers will understand that I have to do serious work.
Thank you so much. So can we take two more questions? Is that okay? Okay. I think we have one question from Aisha, who's asking about your thoughts on Israeli groups that are making plans to settle in Gaza. Do you think anything will be done to prevent this?
I don't believe, unless the ethnic cleansing succeeds, we still don't know what's going to happen. In the case of the people currently in Rafah, pressure might be put on CC. You can't predict these things, and they will be expelled. But if they're not expelled, you have to remember, why did Sharon redeploy the troops and empty the settlements in the first place? Well, you surely remember because you're a Gazan. Because the settlement enterprise didn't work in Gaza. Only around 8,000 Israelis went there, and they didn't want to be surrounded by all of these Palestinians, these people in Gaza. It was not a smart, it didn't feel like a smart thing to be in the middle of that place, with people where the natives are restless, The reason the settlement enterprise ended in Gaza, obviously the occupation remained, but the settlement enterprise, the reason it ended was because 40 years, it ended in 2005. So that's 77, 87, 97, 2000. So 40 years later, there were only 8,000 settlers in Gaza. It didn't work. So they decided it made more sense to empty out Gaza from these settlers and then claim, well, you see, we are making a step towards peace. And then, of course, what they did was then use it as a pretext to, as an excuse not to negotiate over the West Bank. The famous statement by Dov Weissglass, who was Sharon's advisor, Dov Weissglass, and he said, we empty out the settlements in Gaza, then we could freeze the peace process. But the other reason was they knew it was a losing venture. Nobody wanted
it's
to go.
It's expensive to maintain.
Yeah, it was very expensive to maintain.
Very expensive.
8,000 settlers among 2 million Gazans who aren't thrilled by the prospect of having these settlers in their midst.
I grew up next to Kfar Darom, and a settlement of 300 strong, and the 70,000 people of Deir el-Balah, my hometown, they definitely were not thrilled about the 300 settlers. I will end with this question. And it's a question that was asked by multiple viewers, and it's about the future. I know historians don't like to be asked to predict the future, Um, and I know that it's very difficult to speculate in light of the level of uncertainty that we are experiencing right now. But where do you see things headed, and how would you say you see Gaza in 5 years from now?
I'm very pessimistic. I have to admit that, because there are all these lies now. They said, oh, if Hamas would only return the hostages, everything would be okay. It's all Hamas's fault. It just nauseates to listen to the lies. The Israeli government has kept saying, we are going to have an absolute military victory in Gaza. That's what they say every day. We will have an absolute military victory. It has nothing to do with the hostages. If every hostage were returned, that still wouldn't meet Israel's avowed goal. The avowed goal is an absolute military victory in Gaza. Secondly, what does that absolute victory mean? It means that Israel decided on October 7th that, of course, what happened was a horror. However, everybody knows the cliche, every crisis is also an opportunity. And so Israel on October 7th realized this horror that was unfolded on October 7th was also an opportunity. You know what the opportunity was? The opportunity was, for once and for all, to solve the Gaza question. They were not going to let this operate. Israelis are very good. There are many ways that are completely overestimated. But one thing you can say, politically, they know how to exploit an opportunity. I can go through it. I've written a lot about it, how they find opportunities to exploit. You remember, you're too young to remember, Netanyahu in 1989 during the Tiananmen massacre, he said we should use this opportunity to expel the Palestinians to expel hundreds of Palestinians from the West Bank. They used the opportunity of November 4th, 2008. They used the opportunity of Obama being elected president, the first Black president, when everybody's attention was on the presidential campaign. They used that opportunity to kill several Hamas militants, which ended the ceasefire and then culminated in the Operation Cast Lead. They used the opportunity of the Malaysian airliner that went down over Ukraine. They used that opportunity to launch Operation Protective Edge. They're very good at that. They're very good. One second, let me just get one thing. They're very skillful at that. And they see, it's not past tense, they see October 7th as the opportunity. I'm going to just get one quote. They saw here. They saw October 7th as a crisis, a catastrophe, but also as an opportunity to solve the Gaza question. And already I was rereading my book on Gaza because, as I said, I put Gaza behind me in 2020. And when this thing happened, I had to start rereading and refreshing my mind, jogging my memory. And I was struck at the very end, it's page 360. Well, there's still 100 pages to go, but that's mostly appendices. I quote an Israeli official. Now listen to what the Israeli official said. This is 2016. Another war with Gaza was inevitable, senior Israeli officials said in 2016. Quote, we cannot conduct a constant war of attrition, meaning those operations, Cast Lead, Pillar of Defense, Protective Edge. We cannot conduct a constant war of attrition. Therefore, the next conflict has to be the last conflict. And that turned out to be, not by me, I'm just quoting, it turned out to be prophetic. They want this one, which is the next one, to be the last conflict. They're going to solve the Gaza question. So that's grounds for pessimism. Secondly, I think both sides are resolved that they will not be defeated this time. Hezbollah has made clear we will not accept a Hamas defeat. And Israel has made clear we will get absolute victory. That is zero sum. It's not an optimistic scenario. And thirdly, I still am of the opinion that I hate to say this to you as a son of Gaza, but I think we're still early in the conflict. I do not believe Israel will let Hezbollah get away with what it did the last 6 months. Now, you could say they didn't do all that much, but they did defy Israel. 100,000 Israelis have been removed from their homes in the north, and Hezbollah has attacked sacred Israeli territory.
The north has become the new Gaza envelope, kind of.
Yeah. Yes. And I don't believe Israel will let that go.
Mm-hmm.
Because Israel, as you know, its whole defense strategy is built on this principle of what they call deterrence capability. And deterrence capability is just a fancy technical term for the Arab fear of us. We have to restore that Arab fear of us. So I don't think we're approaching. I don't see even how it can end. I mean, I toss it in my mind. How can it end? You and I know, I don't want to talk about the practicability of a two-state settlement, but it's absolutely impossible now because of a very simple reason. When there was talk about a two-state settlement in the year 2000, the Clinton negotiations, and then 2008 with the Annapolis negotiations culminating in the Olmert offer. If you read those negotiations, they were arguing over percentages. Israel wants to keep 80% of the settlers in the West Bank. The Palestinian side says, we'll let you keep 60%. Israel wants to keep the settlement blocks. The Palestinian side says, we'll let you keep the settlements on 2% of the land, but we won't let you keep the settlement blocks on 10% of the land. It was arguments over percentages. Israel says, we'll let you bring in 5,000 refugees under what they called family reunification. The Palestinian side say, no, you have to take in about, the numbers usually were in the hundreds of thousands, meaning the refugees in Lebanon. So they were talking about something like between 100 and 250,000, okay? The current government and the current political spectrum won't even give the Palestinians a bread box, won't give them a broom closet, won't take back one refugee. They want to expel 2 million refugees. Yeah. So there's no basis at this moment in time for two states. And then what is then the alternative? Sometimes I think an international military force, a peacekeeping force. But then there's a very basic question. Where is it going to be settled? Will it be settled on the border with Israel, the June 67 border? Will it be settled around the settlements? Where will this be positioned, this international peacekeeping force. I don't see an end. I wish I could say positive things, but that's what my reason tells me. And you know what? In situations like this, I hope and pray I'm wrong. I do.
In any case, we must brace ourselves for a difficult period ahead of us. Whether this war ends or not, I think the aftermath.
I can't do it much longer. I am burned out. But then I have to keep saying how those people in Gaza do it. I don't know. I don't know.
Indeed. Dr. Norman Finkelstein, thank you so much for joining us today. I know how busy you are, and you've been doing.
It's not a question of busy. It's just a question of being exhausted, and also rising to the occasion, which means I have to keep doing serious work. I have to read, figure out what's going on. Okay, so nice to meet you, and you're a son of Gaza. My heart goes out to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Norman Finkelstein. And on behalf of the board and team at the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center, we thank you for joining us today and talking to us about the March of Return 6 years on, and sharing your reflections on the current moment that we're in. We're grateful for your work and scholarship and activism, and we shall continue this conversation hopefully under better circumstances. For those who joined via Zoom or via any of the other live stream platforms, thank you so much for joining us. And sorry we couldn't take most of the questions we received, but hopefully you can join us for future events, and we'll address some of these questions soon. Dr. Finkelstein, thank you so much, and everybody, thank you, and hopefully we'll see you soon in our next event. Thank you.